first time I heard about Tomb Raider, I actually was reading an issue of Die Hard Game Fan in '95, and it was literally like a 4-page spread about the game and its interesting 3D environments, and that it was one of the first major 3D games with a female lead. And that's really what caught my interest the most. Unfortunately, I did not get a PlayStation or Saturn right away when the game first came out. So it was one of the games that I was really looking forward to, but I just didn't play it right away when it first released.
When did I hear first about Tomb Raider? Just through gaming magazines at the time, mostly. At the time, 3D gaming was still, at least for consoles anyway, kind of a big deal, so magazines were hyping it up with big spreads. Oh, here's this new game coming out, Tomb Raider, and you're going to be exploring and caves and shit. So it was, you would see the full-page advertisements, you would see the multiple-page previews, front covers for gaming magazines, pimping the game. It was, at the time, it wasn't quite on the level of how we see things now for like a Mass Effect, but it was still pretty much out there. If you were reading any kind of gaming magazines, it was kind of a big deal. And just the cover, just the box in general, especially for the PC version, with this weird angular box with just the character on the front, and just going into your local game store, seeing that, you're like, oh, this is different. So there was a fairly decent amount of hype built up for it well in advance, I felt.
I first heard about Tomb Raider. I didn't really hear about it. I just played it. We didn't really. Maybe it was probably in the first EGM, early EGMs, and those EGMs. I mean, out of the EGM, we just rented it and we heard it was good, and it was one of the early PS1 games. So, just playing it with my brothers. That's how we first heard about it. First played it.
I actually got the first game for Christmas, '96, from my uncle, and it was for the PC. When I started playing the game right away, the first thing I was not a big fan of was the introduction of tank controls for the game. It felt very awkward, but then again, it was one of the first 3 games I ever played, and it was very unique. I really loved how big the levels were, how you could explore, find, secrets every nook and cranny, how you could pretty much solve all kinds of unique puzzles, combat a whole bunch of different types of animals, from bears to wolves to dinosaurs to ancient Atlantean beasts. And it was a lot of fun, and to this day, it still leaves a mark on me.
Tomb Raider was really interesting when it first came out. Like, the first game, there wasn't a lot like it. Like, when 3D gaming first came to the consoles, when you first had it for the PlayStation, the first game a lot of people played that did anything with fully 3D graphics was probably something like Warhawk, maybe Tobal, Resident Evil. But a lot of those games had bases in other games from the PC, or you had seen similar things before on the PC. With Tomb Raider, that was kind of the first third-person action-adventure shooting mashup game of its type, and it really was an interesting and new experience for what it was, where you would spend, 10, 15, 20 minutes shooting down bears or wolves or what have you, and then half an hour climbing around in all of these crazy places trying to figure out, how do I go forward from here? How do I solve this puzzle? There weren't a lot of games in general that did what it was doing, and it was really neat and interesting at the time.
One of the most memorable moments of the game for me was obviously the one everyone always talks about, and that was running into the T-Rex for the first time. You just start off like climbing over a bunch of rocks, and then you go into this giant lush green area with a waterfall, and you fight off a couple of raptors, which is the first thing that actually freaks you out, and it freaked me out quite a bit. And once you dispose of the raptors and you just move forward, all of a sudden you see the screen start shaking, and then you start hearing some noise, and then out of nowhere you see this giant dinosaur, a T-Rex, roaring and charging at you, and all you are filled with is panic and where the hell am I gonna go? So, but it wasn't. Unfortunately, killing a T-Rex is a lot easier than it seems because all you got to do is get into this little mini cave, let the T-Rex run around, and you just blast it to death.
Things that I find memorable in the first game: Laura's pyramid pits. Seriously, you can put a fucking eye out with those things. Jesus Christ. Beyond that, just like the T-Rex battle, everybody remembers the T-Rex battle. It was amazing for its time. You're just running through this area. Oh, what's going on? Oh my god! And, you know, after you finish changing your pants, you go back and you fight the boss.
For me, the most memorable thing about playing the first Tomb Raider game was probably fighting this guy that you see over here. Back then, we didn't have these big giant bosses that you see in games like Resistance 2 or Shadow of the Colossus or God of War. So seeing a character that was this big just appear out of nowhere, you would think it was the final boss, and it wasn't. This is the second to last level. There's way more after this. In fact, the final boss was a big letdown compared to this guy. A lot of people will say it's that T-Rex scene from the third level that they remember. Not for me. I made it through the entire game. It was definitely this guy.
Another memorable moment actually is the who didn't do this a million times? Killing Lara Croft on purpose, swan diving into a pile of rocks, hearing those bones break. The moment you hit the ground, just going crunch.
What happened was we would push up square in R1, and for some reason she'd do a diving motion, even if there was no water, and then she would die. She would hit her face on the floor and have that signature sound of 3 like sounds. It's just ba-da-doom. And that totally summed up what breaking her neck meant. It was funny though. And you make sure you had to save it before.
I mean, and it's not just. It's when you first do it by accident, but then it's when you start doing it on purpose, it just takes on a life of its own. Like, you do that in every game, and I think every time I got frustrated, I just purposely killed Lara Croft, swan dived into a bunch of rocks.
I absolutely felt that Tomb Raider was essential to the growth of 3D gaming. The big thing is that a lot of people hadn't done what Tomb Raider was doing at the time that came out. Because like I said, again, at this point you were looking at, okay, you had Warhawks, you had... people were starting to go towards platformers, so you had Mario and Crash Bandicoot were going in that direction. But you didn't have the kind of game that Tomb Raider had, because it combined concepts from things that we'd seen before and brought them into 3 dimensions. So you had like the shooter aspects of something like Contra, combined with the exploration elements of your standard adventure games, mashed into this 3-dimensional behind-the-back experience where you're experiencing all of this, where you're trying to puzzle this all out in real time. It was something that showed gamers and developers, holy crap, this is what we can do with a 3-dimensional environment. This is what we can do with 3-dimensional games. We're not stuck with pre-rendered environments and fixed camera angles. We can go crazy with this stuff. And it gave a lot of people the idea that they could do new and different and interesting things because they had that third dimension to work with.
At the beginning of, I guess, the 3D revolution, when Sony was really pulling for 3D games to push the PlayStation, I felt Lara Croft was essentially one of those games that helped pioneered and ushered in the 3D era, along with Mario 64 and Crash Bandicoot. These were games that really pushed the boundaries. Tomb Raider and Lara Croft in general, like, did a great job of doing so because, from a technology standpoint, I mean, the game had a good rendering engine for the system that it was on, and it allowed for... it was practically a game that looked much better than PC games at the time. And this was at a time when PC games and like 32-bit systems that were coming out were starting to look almost the same. And to be able to play a game in 3D, to be able to interact with your environments, to be able to solve puzzles in a unique fashion, to be able to just the idea of exploring and having free range in a game is pretty much what Tomb Raider did, and that's, along with Mario, it definitely made 3D games a staple. And from here on out, I mean, we got some amazing games, and yeah.
Lara Croft, for me, was just the epitome of hot when I was a kid. So, I mean, just saying, like, polygons and the Hey, even my dad was like, "Whoa, look at those! Look at what she had. Like she was a good character model, you know. But as a role model, she was very heroic.
At the time when Tomb Raider came out, the mark that Lara Croft left on me literally began and ended with my hormones. I mean, I was like 14, 15 when that game came out. She was rendered as a strong female lead with giant gazongas. And there wasn't really a whole lot of development to the character. When you first start the game, it's, oh, well, you're Lara Croft, this world-famous adventurer, and we want you to go do this. And I'm like, don't talk to me like we're friends, game. I have no idea who this character is. But it's just instantly, okay, Lara Croft is going to go adventuring this. Because storytelling in general at that point was, aside from your role-playing games, really kind of new for developers. We weren't at the point where you had half-an-hour-long cutscenes introducing a game. So it was literally, you're Lara Croft, go do this for me, and then you're climbing up a mountain and going into this snowy cavern. So the character at the time didn't really have a lot of mark to leave. She was badass, she killed things, whatever, great, but beyond that she was just there. She just existed in the first game.
When I first saw Lara Croft in the issue of Die Hard Game Fan, I was just like, okay, that's interesting, because I actually was used to strong female leads in games, because I played a lot of RPGs and some other games like Metroid, where you had Samus Aran, and then you had you know, Celeste from Final Fantasy VI, Alice from Fantasy Star 4, the one chick from like Potful Mail. So like there were some strong female leads, but Lara Croft in a way paved a way for a stronger female role, and from there on, like, so many other females like started showing up. Like you had the chick, what's her name, from the Pandemonium franchise. You had the girls from Eidos's other fighting game or action game, Fighting Force. You had like a whole bunch of these women just showing up. You had Claire. You had Jill from Resident Evil. You had what's her name from Dino Crisis, Regina, Parasite Eve. You just had a whole bunch of these new strong female women just showing up out of the woodworks.
When Lara first came out, there weren't really a lot of female characters, certainly not a lot of strong female characters, so Lara had the opportunity to leave a very strong mark there. At the time, your strong female characters mostly existed in RPGs, outside of maybe Samus Aran on Metroid. So you would have maybe strong characters like a Terra in Final Fantasy VI or an Alice in Phantasy Star that not a lot of gamers were seeing. Most of your major games were male main characters or non-gender specific main characters. So Lara had a great opportunity there. I don't really feel like Lara developed into the kind of character that was worth being that sort of a role model for women within the male industry until about the third or the fourth game. But at the first game, at the very least, it was, okay, here's this female character, and she's new and she's different, and you don't play a lot of games that have female leads, and she's kicking the crap out of everything that she sees, and that's awesome. So it was a good first start, and then later on, as the character developed, I feel like she became a strong character in a general sense for that sort of movement.
When I first started hearing about Tomb Raider 2, I was initially extremely excited because I enjoyed the first game so much. When I finally got it, my expectations literally were blown through the roof. It was an amazing game. The game had a great way of, you know, pacing you through it like the first game didn't do, because the first game, it pretty much was just forcing you to figure things out, whereas this one, it kind of held your hand a little at the beginning, trying to, you know, get you in a sense of what's going on here, because it was trying to be a much bigger game in its scope with its story. And in this game, Tomb Raider 2, they actually had a much stronger storyline, much more interesting characters, much more dynamics going on, as opposed to the first one where it was just, oh, here's an opening cutscene, hey Lara, I'm hiring you to go treasure hunting. This one, it's like, oh, I think I'm going to go, you know, find some ancient dagger, just for some and giggles. And it turns out to be like, okay, it's her and the Illuminati racing to get this dagger, which apparently bestows somebody great power. And Tomb Raider 2, I mean, starting off the game, like I said, kind of held your hand, but it just kept getting bigger and bigger as the game went, to the point where, like, it wasn't just exploring tombs, it was now you were driving boats around through the canals of Italy, you were deep sea diving and trying to avoid sharks while trying to explore boats. It was so much more, and it was just I literally feel like the game like peaked way too early with this with Tomb Raider 2, because it just did so many things at once that made it great.
I feel like Tomb Raider 2 was the logical extension of where you could go with the first Tomb Raider, and I feel like it was a lot better game. The game started out in a capacity that was more hand-holding. It kind of sort of said, okay, we understand that in the first game you were just dicking around in this hole for an hour and didn't really know exactly what you were doing. So here's more of an idea of where you need to go. Visually, the game improved quite a bit. You noticed more details in the character, and you felt less like you were probably going to cut yourself on her tits. The level structure was more in line with where it needed to be. The levels were designed in a better capacity, I felt. You felt like Core had learned the lessons from the first game, and that they had said, okay, we did this, now let's do this. And they began expanding on the concept, and they began building on the concept. And they built a game that took the ideas that worked in the first game and added new ideas to that. They showed that they were learning things, and that they were going forward with the game, and that they had more ideas on what to do to keep making the game successful, and it really worked a lot better.
Tomb Raider 2 wasn't that great. At least I didn't like it. Well, it was an okay game. It was not great. It wasn't like the first game. The first game, Lara, she spent her time in the tombs hunting treasures, and Tomb Raider 2, a lot of that time was, instead of tombs and in caves hunting animals and things like that, she was out in Venice on a motorboat. She was out in public areas. She was dealing with people rather than animals, and for some reason it never really struck me the same way that the original Tomb Raider did. And I think it was because she wasn't in that whole tomb atmosphere.
Tomb Raider 2, I think, was one of my favorite games, was because just, one, she had a ponytail. It wasn't just a bun. That was cool. That was hot. I like ponytails. And two, let me see. I think the first stage just started all off well. I mean, it was a large stage, it was a bigger stage, but it wasn't hard to go through. It was easy to navigate. You had certain parts that you could climb and obstacles, and it wasn't entirely difficult. Then you also had in that same stage, near the end, you had a bunch of like Indiana Jones style running around boulders, running through spikes and different traps, and then if you would climb down like a certain, well, I didn't find that out until after, but if you climbed all the way down when there was a zip line, you had to fight like T-Rexes, I believe. And then after that you had Venice. Venice was one of the funnest stages, all 4 or 5 of them. You had the first one with the boat, and it was a challenge, but it was also well executed, I believe. And once we got to the underwater stage, we didn't know what to do. So we had to swim to a certain area, and for me, I didn't skip those stages much. I like playing the underwater stages because, I don't know, there were sharks. It was interesting, it was scary, it was an adventure. And after that, you'd make your way to the Tibetan hills, and the Tibet hills were fun stages. There were so many stages in Tomb Raider 2 that you wouldn't get bored with yourself. Or you wouldn't get bored playing the game.
When I first saw Lara Croft, honestly, I wasn't that interested in her as a character, because in terms of sex appeal, I mean, obviously because of early 3D gaming, you weren't able to have enough polygons in a character model because of the rendering engines you have. So you had Lara Croft with these triangle like boobs, and then you had her with this bun on the back of her head, but then you also look at like the booklet and the ads and stuff like that, and then she's a little more, curvaceous, I guess. And it was just like, just a standard marketing ploy. It wasn't until Tomb Raider 2 and the boom of, like, I guess you could say, sex appeal in gaming in the late 90s that they decided to take it off and run with it in Tomb Raider 2, where, I remember reading an issue of EGM, like right there on the front cover, Lara Croft in a wetsuit, just crawling on her hands and knees, looking all sexy with that nice, nasty grin on her, biting her lip or whatever. The pictures of her standing there with a bikini with a machine gun in her hands, just pretty much just trying to show just off her sex appeal. There was obviously the you know, the improvements in the number of polygon counts for Lara Croft. You know, her boobs are actually round now. She has a ponytail. She's got a more of a streamlined figure now that became a staple for the franchise. And from there, it kind of just got even more overboard, because then you had the comic books that started coming out where, like, some really talented artists, you know, took Lara Croft and ran with it, and I'd say she puts like 90% of like the Marvel female cast to shame. And then you had the toy lines, which actually started off rather hideous, and then you have like the more modern statues of like what actually looked like her character model in game, and like I think it kind of got a little over the top after a while for her sex appeal.
I felt like the increase in Lara Croft's sex appeal was a kind of a logical, if not necessarily ideal, extension for the character. When Lara Croft first came out, I don't think that anybody in core had any idea what she was going to be. The story goes that literally they were just playing around with the dimension sliders one day and ended up giving her the giant boobs that they gave her in the first place. So I think they kind of said, oh, well, she's an attractive female character, you know, that could be something, but they didn't really bank on it going in the direction that it did. So when they realized that there was this entire community of people who were playing this game and wanted to see Lara Croft naked, they said, okay, well, let's try to pander to that within the confines of what we can do. So, holy shit, the boobs are everywhere. It was logical, it's understandable, and I can appreciate why you would do it from a financial perspective and from a branding perspective. It was kind of a little embarrassing. And honestly, I'm kind of glad that the character has gotten past that point now, where it's just like, okay, Lara Croft is just a character. She exists and we do things with her. I still feel like the thing that happened with Blood Rain was a far more embarrassing situation, because at least Lara never posed naked for Playboy. But, you know, still not a shining moment for the gaming community, I guess.
When Tomb Raider 3 was announced, I was still ecstatic, because I was a big fan of 1 and 2, and I was really looking forward to 3. When I finally got around to playing 3, though, I was extremely underwhelmed. Sure, yeah, they increased, you know, the Lara Croft polygon count again. They added new moves, but in a weird way, they kind of downsized the game but made it bigger. They took out, whereas Tomb Raider 2 had a ton of levels, Tomb Raider 3 only had 5 like worlds to explore, and each of them were extremely huge. And in a way, it kind of felt repetitive, because while each world was unique, like you had the jungles, you had the desert, you had the Arctic to explore, they were just, it just after a while it just got monotonous, it got boring, it felt like you just been there, done that, and it was starting to wear on you after a while, and I didn't really completely play through the game all the way, mainly because of just that feeling, like I've been there and done that, and I was hoping they might, you know, correct that with future Tomb Raider games.
When we're discussing Tomb Raider 3 as a game, so professional wrestling fans who have spent any amount of time watching it will remember a match between Rob Van Dam and John Cena during an ECW pay-per-view. I think it was one night only, where the fans spent a good 20 minutes chanting same old shit at John Cena. And I kind of felt like I was chanting that at Tomb Raider 3 for the entirety of the time that I spent playing it, because that's literally what it was. As you're just like, okay, I'm going to go sliding down this and jumping into this and blah, 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 and this is the same game that I already paid $50 for. What the hell? The environments were more expansive, certainly, but, you know, making your environments bigger doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing anything with your game. Congratulations, you figured out how to maximize your storage space. Do something else with the game. Anything else. I don't care what. And it was just literally the same experience in new environments. There was nothing new or exciting or interesting to the game, really.
Tomb Raider 3 came out, they went back to the tomb atmosphere. They said, you know what, people didn't like being in Venice. They didn't like being in these real-world locations. They preferred the caves. But then Tomb Raider 3 sucked. Tomb Raider 3 was such a huge disappointment that Tomb Raider 3 is the last Tomb Raider game I've ever played. I played Tomb Raider 3 and said, I've had enough of this. I don't need to play the series anymore. It clearly has no idea where it wants to go. And after that, I left Tomb Raider to word of mouth. Every time a new Tomb Raider game came out, I asked my friends who had played it, is it worth getting? And not once has anybody said yes.
I kind of feel like at the end of Tomb Raider 3, we kind of sort of realized that this was probably about as far as Core was going to be able to go with the franchise. I'm kind of upset, I'm kind of disappointed that it took us another 3 games to get to the point where somebody else was given the ball and told to run with it, but, you know, you're going to stick with what works, and Tomb Raider 3 did sell a load of copies, so I can nod and go along with that.
The first 3 Tomb Raider games, I actually have to say, even though the third one wasn't as great as the second one, I still thoroughly enjoyed them. I still thoroughly enjoyed it, and I honestly didn't think that the franchise would actually, you know, peak anymore. I think it would probably streamlined, and I just hope that, you know, the new Tomb Raider games, they actually try to find a better direction for it.